It is nice to be back in New South Wales, where I did go to school at Revesby South Public School and Pitney Point High School, and where I did go to university at University of New England and also Alexander Mackie CAE, and then taught at UWS, UNE and University of Wollongong before finally going over to the dark side in Victoria. A bit of a challenge to speak on for just 10 minutes on this topic, which is I've been intimately involved with for a long time, researching successful or quality teaching, but also the interplay with things like leadership and professional learning and professional teaching standards and all of those sorts of things. So we'll have a go. Now, as a result of that work, 2008, I published a book called How to Get Your School Moving and Improving, and I'm just putting the finishing touches to another one, which is going to be a follow-up to that. But in looking at successful teachers and faculties and departments and schools and even systems, not just in Australia but overseas, I've seen some commonalities. And the first one is that in those classrooms, faculties, schools, etc., there's a central focus on each student. And that focus is both on the student as a learner and a person. So on the learning side, that means we can assess them. We know where they've been, we know where they are, we know what we need to do with them to move their learning forward. That's the learning side. But the person side's important too, so that they're not just a number, a name. We actually have that relationship with them because we know that the relationship between teachers and students has a very large effect size. There's a lot of kids in schools who go from week to week, month to month without really coming to our attention. They're not naughty enough, maybe they're not bright enough, maybe they're not attractive enough to actually get our attention. So that balance is essential, and it's two sides of the one coin. And in some schools the focus is more on the learning side. You know, we're a school that gets wonderful results, and if you don't shape up you can go somewhere else. On the other hand, sometimes it's more on the person side. Oh, we're a welfare school, the best thing we can do for these kids is give them some basics and send them on their way, etc. Both of those views are wrong. The best teachers, the best schools get that balance right. So that's our first big lever, and it's an absolutely essential one, to focus on the learner. The second thing that comes through from the research and everything else is the importance of leadership. And leadership isn't just people in formal positions of authority. Every teacher's a leader. When you take your class, that's leadership. When you take a sporting group, cultural group, sit on a committee, take an excursion, whatever, that's all leadership. So our concept of distributed leadership, I think, has developed over the last 20 years or so. Leadership is another big lever. Often the effects are harder to measure, they're indirect, but you know, the effect size research says it's about 0.39, 0.4. But again, it's such a vital thing. You can have good teaching without having a good school. You can't have a good school without good leadership. What else do we see? We see professional learning. Professional learning is absolutely essential. Again, it's a very large effect size. I can't see how you can change or improve without professional learning. What teachers know, can do, even value. And often, a lot of these reform efforts that we see, the changes that occur, where they fall down is there's not sufficient investment in professional learning to make it work. So that's our next big lever. And the final one, of course, is what we would call quality teaching. And there's two sides to this, the quality of the teacher and the quality of their teaching. And there's been a lot of focus on the quality of teachers, entry standards, programs, all those sorts of things, but also the quality of teaching in terms of outcomes that we might be able to measure in various ways. So they're the big levers. Okay, so how are we going? Well, these are international test results you're all familiar with. The short answer is we're doing okay, but we're falling away. In comparison with other OECD countries, we are going downwards. And one of the key factors in that is around equity. We're still in that quadrant, we're hanging on to that quadrant which is high performance, but we're also in that quadrant that says high performance and low equity. And it's a real issue for us. But there's another pattern in there which is quite significant. Compared with the same sorts of countries, basically OECD countries and a few others, we're doing better in secondary than in primary. Or if you want to look at the other way, we're doing worse in primary than in secondary. Why might that be? And I presented a paper on this last year at a national conference of the Australian College of Educators, and the Australian reprinted something from that, and then I got attacked on the basis of what was in the Australian. I was not at any point attacking primary teachers or primary teaching or primary schooling. I was actually very, very sympathetic to the challenges of that particular area. A lot of the things we see advocated in schooling to fix the problems of schooling are pointed towards secondary education, where in actual fact we know primary education is so important, and increasingly we know early childhood education is so important. So it's okay, but SES in particular has too much of an influence. Location, sector, indigeneity, etc. And the influence of those things, we know from the standardised testing, the international testing, the influence of those factors is growing. And I've mentioned that primary-secondary disparity. So what do we need? Well, this is a 10-minute shopping list, I suppose. That the first thing we really need to do is make sure we don't waste our money, we don't waste our time, we concentrate on things we know work. Evidence-based practice, really. And there's two sorts of evidence. There's the evidence that other people have gathered for us previously, and then there's the evidence that we can gather ourselves to inform what we do. There's still too much shiny products, people going around selling simplistic ideas, quick fix things that are going to turn your school around. We know what works. We've got decades of research about what works in teaching and in leadership and in schooling. The big challenge for us is to upscale it, to get a good teacher in every classroom, for example. So we really have to question from a basis of evidence some of the things that people want to sell us. And in some cases, we are adopting practices that have not only not worked elsewhere, but have been disproved elsewhere. But we still get in line to do this. So primary education in particular, I think, is susceptible to a lot of these fads, fashions, trends and so on. And it's interesting that when you point out to people, as I do in the various courses that I'm involved with, look, this thing doesn't actually work, or in actual fact, this is harmful. Oh, it doesn't really matter. Yes, it does matter. Would we put up with, for example, medical professionals continuing to use a procedure that we know hurts people? It's equally important. Lives are also at stake. So that pseudoscience there that bedevils us, and we want to do the right thing by our kids. So if someone comes along and they offer us something, it's attractive. Oh, it's only a few $1,000. We'll use this, but we don't go through that proper process. I mean, one of the things we need to be is a critical consumer of research, really critical, informed. So we don't just grab whatever comes along. The business about knowing students as learners really is about diagnosis assessment. And we use the term clinical just to distinguish ourselves, I suppose, in some ways from other sorts of practices. Clinical, not in the sense it's a deficit model and we're looking to find out what's wrong with people, but if you go to a very good doctor, they will spend a lot of time just talking with you. And they've only got one patient at a time, and I'm well aware of that. They'll spend time talking with you, observing, getting your case history and everything else before they prescribe anything. Assessment is the key to this, and I think it's somewhat ironic or paradoxical, or whatever you want to call it, that we had a lot of testing, including external testing, before we had the PD around assessment to go with it. It's a sort of classic cart before the horse type thing. We need teachers with brains. We need high intellectual capacity teachers. And some people will tell you it doesn't matter what people go into their teacher education course with, it's what they come out with. Both are important. It makes a difference. And I'm fortunate to work at a place where we do have very high entry standards and it's a graduate entry program. I can tell you it makes a difference. So we need to get the best and brightest. And it's not just sufficient to like kids or whatever. We need people with those abilities. And this is where the whole issue of entry standards and screening and so on becomes so important. We also need leaders, school leaders, who are, if you like, instructional leaders, with a strong foundation in teaching and learning, who can lead that in schools. They don't have to be an expert in all parts of the curriculum, but again, they can be a critical consumer and they can work with and through the people they work with to see that we do the things that actually have high impact. We've sometimes got to go back and think about what schooling's about. In my time, it's sort of moved from being a service, a right, to something that you pay for. And if you can pay more money, you can get a so-called better service. We need to go back and actually say to ourselves, what's our prime focus? And I'm a big fan of the Melbourne Declaration and the Adelaide Declaration before that, and the Hobart Declaration before that, because it talks about academic, personal and social domains, not just one aspect. And it talks about equity and it talks about excellence. It's not just one or the other. We've got to try and lift the bar and close the gap. And that notion that every student experiences academic success and personal development and social development, I think is really important. Certainly too great an emphasis on those external test results can be counterproductive. There's enough research out there. We're adding to it all the time, but the fact is often the quick fixes that are adopted come from the economists, the people selling things, the business sector, who've got very, very simplistic ideas. I mean, I was at a lunch like this in Melbourne with a lot of the corporate heavyweights who were there, and they were told, we have a proxy, we have a measure of teacher quality in Australia. It's called NAPLAN. Sorry, it's not. That is not the purpose, and there's about a dozen reasons that you can think of why it's not a very good proxy for teacher quality. But we've got this simplistic stuff, you know, sack the bottom 5% of teachers, introduce bonuses, etc., etc., reward by results. And when you start to unpack that, of course, we all know how complex that is. There is a cycle that needs to be broken, and professional learning is the key. And I think we don't, despite all the money we might spend on professional learning, mirror what we see in other occupations. It's slowly sort of crept its way into the requirements for teacher registration and keeping your certification at various levels and so on. But in comparison with other professions, we've still got a way to go. It's really one of the big levers. And it isn't just the people who are going through their teacher education courses, it's the people who are out there who have a right, as well as a responsibility, to engage in professional learning. This business, you know, forget everything you've learnt at university, this is the way we do it here. We tried that in 1975 and it didn't work. One that I heard just 2 years ago in a school, this is a working class school in a working class area. Don't expect too much and you won't be disappointed. There's a lot of low expectations still associated with low SES that really plays out in a whole range of ways. We do have to recognise these inequalities. And this is the whole business about, you know, targeting funding or focusing funding. And in particular, those early years are so important. It's too late to play catch-up in high school. It's too late to play catch-up in the latter years of primary school. We know that kids are going into primary already with significant gaps in their development. Obviously, verbal literacy and other things as well. And we know that gap can get wider for some people. And we know from things like NAPLAN that there's a certain percentage of kids who basically regress from years 5 to year 7 and from 7 to 9. They go backwards. Now, Wilson and Pickett, I don't know whether you're familiar with Wilkinson and Pickett, this book, The Spirit Level, but what it does is demonstrate quite powerfully that inequality is actually worse for everybody, including the people at the top, the so-called advantaged people. And the facts are indisputable, as Michelle mentioned. We are becoming a less equitable society, and that's playing out in all sorts of ways. And we see, for example, it's not just school education, but we see what's happened in TAFE in areas like Victoria, which I'm familiar with, where the money's just been stripped out, ripped out. And those TAFE colleges are so important in the life of country towns and for country people. And they've been replaced by RTOs of various sorts who, if you read the front pages today, are ripping the system blind in many cases. Ken, I'm going to quote you here. I didn't know you were going to be here. You can read it out if you like, but the contrasts are remarkable. I was in Germany for 3 months last year and I'm going back in about 2 weeks' time. Spent a fair bit of time in Germany. In 2000, when the PISA results were first released, or in 2001, for 2000 they came out, the Germans went into a state of PISA shock. It was a great blow to the national prestige, the national reputation, national pride and so forth. Now, Germany's got a highly regulated system of education. 93% of kids go to government schools, and the remaining ones, they go to schools which are tightly regulated. Teacher training itself is extremely high standard, tightly controlled on a state basis. And really, the emphasis that Germany places on training, education, is almost second to none. But they were lagging, and what they did was basically through will more than anything else, not through deregulating what was going on, they lifted the performance of the whole country. And the worry that I've got, and I did a paper on this last month in Brisbane, was that they've managed to turn things around. They've improved their results on the international measures every year since 2000, and we've done the opposite. And they've done it through a tightly regulated system, which some people would say is not innovative and not flexible and not responsive and not agile, to use Malcolm Turnbull's words. We, on the other hand, are going headlong down the path of deregulation. And I suspect if we think that's going to deliver the improvements that we're looking for, we are sadly mistaken. So this is one of Paul Brock's favourite sayings from the late Garth Boomer. When I talk about this stuff, sometimes people are saying, oh, well, it's a back to basics type thing that you're advocating. No, it's actually forward to fundamentals, and including a focus on things like equity and targeted funding and investing in teachers' professional learning and investing in good leadership, the things that we know from the international and the national research make such a difference. Thank you.